Want to shop Walmart Black Friday deals first? Walmart Plus members get early access to our hottest deals. Join now and get 50% off a 1-year annual membership. Shop Black Friday deals first with Walmart Plus. See terms at walmartplus.com.
Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm Lori Adams Brown, and this is a podcast for those who are different and want to make a difference. Does it feel like your whole world has just been turned upside down? Are you having trouble remembering to drink water or eat? Does it feel like you're walking in quicksand? You can't even concentrate on normal things? You may be walking through trauma. There may be a crisis in your life or in your government that is causing you to feel that you don't know how to put one foot in front of the other. I have walked through times like this, and it really has helped me to walk with a professional therapist through these times. I highly encourage you to find a therapist, and at betterhelp.com/difference, you can get 10% off your first month today. I myself have benefited from a therapist I've worked with there. You can message your therapist in between sessions, go to extra courses around grief or trauma, find support groups, and also really have a person to help you walk through some of the most difficult parts of your life right now. You can get 10% off your first month today by going to www.betterhelp.com/difference. You deserve to heal. Today, we're going to talk about a pretty heavy topic, and I want to issue a trigger warning here at the outset. If you are an international adoptee or an adoptee domestically, there may be aspects of this conversation that are triggering for you. And also, if you have adopted internationally or domestically, you also may find that some of the topics we discussed today are triggering in a sense that it makes you start to deal with some of the systems that you may or may not have been complicit or colluded with, even without your knowledge at the time. So I just want to offer, if you are finding yourself somewhat in a space today where you just don't feel ready for this, that's okay to pause it and take it in chunks. Or to not listen altogether for a while until you feel ready. I'm going to go ahead and reference a previous conversation I had here on the podcast with an international adoptee from South Korea to the United States. It's Cameron Lee Small. I'll link that episode in the show notes. He has a whole therapy practice around adoptees and the journey for adoptive families that center adoptees. And his book, The Adoptee's Journey, was something he was on the podcast speaking about not long ago. And in light of that, I want each of you to know that this conversation is so important because there are so much internationally, geopolitically that's involved when it comes to adoption that we are starting to unpack in the years since we've become more aware of what has been happening. So today on the show, I've invited Gretchen Sisson. Gretchen is a research sociologist and author of Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. She is based at Advancing New Standards in Reproductive Health in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. Her work on adoption relinquishment after abortion denial was cited in the dissent for the Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization and has been covered, you may have seen it in either the Washington Post, Time Magazine, The Nation, NPR, New York Magazine, Vox, Mother Jones, many other outlets. And she's coming on the show today to give us her knowledge around her research on women who went through with a pregnancy and where they just, followed them over several year period with all kinds of data and information around their mental health, their physical health, their financial health, and what it looks like to walk through that and whether they relinquish their babies for adoption or whether they didn't. And all of that is something we're going to discuss today because the Venn diagram around adoption and abortion care in the United States in particular has been a topic that has really related to the most recent election that we just saw, but also going forward with the Dobbs decision as it's being left up to the states to decide around different regulations. So this is a very complicated and complex and very nuanced conversation that could potentially cause some to start to feel feelings of guilt and shame. And so if that is the case, I do ask that you listen with an open mind, with checking your own assumptions, which is something I also had to do preparing for this conversation and in the middle of the conversation, and just with a spirit of curiosity and openness and walking through what it might be like to be either an adoptee, a mother who was relinquishing her baby, a mother who chose to receive abortion care, and all of the other nuances within the conversation. I hope that we can embrace empathy in this moment and allow the research and the data really to speak to us. When it comes to complicity, I feel like, we're all complicit in a lot of ways. And the reality is, one of the most powerful things we can do is to assess how we vote, to assess how we spend our money, to assess where we have omitted to fund or use our money and time and resources in either volunteering or financially giving on Giving Tuesday and those kinds of moments with our money toward organizations that are producing good in the world. And that goodness is often skewed by large powers and systems that can be exploited in a system where capitalism, which, benefits many of us, can also not benefit the ones that are most vulnerable. And so recently I've been going through like a period of time where I have gotten off Twitter, and I have started to look at ways I spend my money with a little more scrutiny, and, realizing that shame and guilt may come up, but also walking through that piece by piece. Now, full disclosure, I'm not a perfect person. I do shop at Amazon. I often feel guilty about that. But I do look for other ways to buy books, and, sometimes it's a matter of convenience. But when it comes to complicity, there are some specific areas where just my conscience will no longer allow me to support certain things. And those are individual decisions for each of us. But as we think about that in this conversation, I want you to go into it with that frame of mind, with openness, with curiosity, with checking your assumptions. Just because we've been told something doesn't mean that it's been true. And to center those who the policies are most affecting, which are the adoptees and the mothers who are, in many cases, being asked to carry a fetus to become a baby and to deliver that baby, and then make the choice of whether to relinquish the baby or not. These are the people that are most affected by these decisions. In a world that often centers the adoptive families, I think that this conversation will help us see other points of view. And once again, on this podcast, we are all about bringing our differences to the table to make a difference together. And that means listening to understand for the facts and feelings of values that are being communicated to us, even if they make us feel a little uncomfortable. So hopefully that's enough to have a disclosure about this particular conversation. And I really am so excited to have Gretchen, this expert in this area, come onto the show to share her vast knowledge and her research that really can make a difference. So a warm welcome to the show, Gretchen Sisson. Hello, Gretchen, and I'm so excited about this conversation today. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast.
Hi, Lori. Thanks for having me.
It's been a hard, we're recording this post election results in the United States, so I don't even bother asking how people are doing. I know I've not been doing all that great, but your work has been sort of central to some of the conversation that's been going on leading up to the election in the United States. It's certainly a global issue. And so as we're talking about this, people are coming in maybe with some understanding of kind of what those dynamics are, but also a whole lot to be learned. My first question for you is, what kind of first drew you in to focus on adoption and sort of the social, political elements surrounding it?
Yeah. So when I started doing research that would eventually become the book, I didn't know I was writing a book. It was back in 2010. So I was in graduate school. And at the time, I was working at an organization called the Alliance on Teen Pregnancy, which was an organization in Boston that supported pregnant and parenting young people. And that was a really crucial way of understanding what I wanted my scholarship to look at. And it was largely the gap between how we understand what teen pregnancy looks like, what we believe teen pregnancy means for young people and their children and their communities, and what it was actually like for the women who were raising children while they were finishing high school and soon thereafter. And that gap between the social narrative and the actual lived experience, and understanding whose parenthood is valued, whose parenthood is marginalized, stigmatized, who we choose to support in different paths to parenting, that really became the heart of my research question. And I think adoption really gets very deeply at that, because adoption at its core, particularly private adoption, which is what I study, which is almost always babies and infant, really newborns usually, looks at the transfer of babies from one family to another, right? One family that for some reason we have deemed unworthy or incapable of raising that child, and transfers them to another family that we believe is a more appropriate home for that baby. And wanting to look at how those narratives take root around who gets to parent, who we support in their path to parenting, and who we really marginalize was something that I wanted to look at much more closely.
Yeah, thank you first of all for this research. It's very important. We've had another guest here on the podcast not long ago who is an international adoptee and is sort of challenging some of those narratives in the work that he does too as a therapist. So much of the narrative around adoption, especially sort of in the 90s, really seemed to be, you'd see magazine covers or news articles about Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt and people adopting internationally, and all of it seemed really happy. But of course, we probably instinctively knew at the time it wasn't all happy, but in the way that especially in the US, our narratives tend to be from our movies being happy Disney endings to kind of an inability to kind of deal with some of the more difficult parts of shame and even a little bit of maybe neocolonization or some of those things that we don't like to talk about that are very shameful for us. How did you see some of those cultural narratives playing into the whole concept around adoption and international adoption specifically?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring up these like magazine covers that we had in the 90s and early 2000s. Because you had Angelina Jolie, Madonna, you had a lot of other high-profile adoptive families. What's particularly interesting about Angelina Jolie's story is that she talked about her children as orphans, right? That they had been orphaned, I believe she specifically said, by the AIDS epidemic in Africa. And then, of course, it turned out years later that her children weren't orphans. Her children had parents, but they had been separated from their children on the basis of poverty. They couldn't afford to care for these children, and they lost them to adoption. And I think that is really telling, because as I talk about in the book, the families that are formed by adoption are always much more visible to us than the families that are separated by adoption. And my book really looks at the experience of birth families, first families, relinquishing families, families of origin, where the children come from, and why they're being separated from their children. In some cases, it's a function of parents terminating their own parental rights. In some cases, it's the state terminating parental rights. In some cases, it's these global geopolitical factors that lead to separation. But I really wanted to set my lens on those families of origin and understanding what led to their children being raised by other families.
Yeah, no, it's so important. The parts of the story that aren't going to be on the front of People magazine, right, is so needed. And there have been certain countries who have over the years sort of changed their policies around international adoption. I know there are families, expat families overseas that I've known that have been in process with international adoption, and then the borders closed to that whole option and change. And then, people become aware along the way sometimes of children being trafficked for this purpose. For those who don't know that, I think some people may know a little bit about it. How would you explain kind of that situation that's been going on?
Yeah. So the peak of international adoption into the United States was 2004. So this is something that grew really, really quickly through the 90s, peaked in 2004, and has fallen really dramatically since then, which means that a lot of these international adoptees into the United States are now adults. So that the peak of that big wave, and a lot of them are going back to their countries of origin, trying to find information about their families. And what they're discovering more and more is that they were often stolen and trafficked. You've seen this out of Korea. There's an incredible amount of information coming out about Korea adoptions. They have South Korea has their own Truth and Reconciliation Commission that has exposed what was happening in that country during the 90s and beyond. Guatemala, a lot of cases have come out about stolen children. Vietnam, and these were some of the top exporting countries into the United States. And then, of course, China with the removal of their their one-child policy, and then they have recently closed their doors to international adoption as well, sort of looking back on that period with a fair amount of national shame for sending so many children abroad. And so international adoption and a lot of these are headlines that have come out just in the last year, right?
Yeah.
Countries that are closing their borders to international adoption. And then on the side of receiving countries, you have a number of Scandinavian countries that are saying we're no longer going to import children for international adoption, or they're looking at that much more deeply. And so I really think that we are at the end of international adoption. The numbers are already, at or under 1,000 children coming into the United States every year for adoption. So it's already very, very low numbers compared to what it was at its peak. But I think that we're going to see that plummet even more dramatically now that they're closing.
It does seem to be the case. There are these families, and in my mind, I'm picturing the millennial family who wants to do good in the world, and it's very Instagrammable. It's going to sound really judgy, my question. And a lot of people are very good-hearted in this process, but haven't done maybe their own personal work of what it means to be anti-racist, what it means to not be involved in anything that would kind of feel like a neo-colonization in any form. Sort of these white saviors is kind of the cliche, I guess, I'm trying to paint a picture of. And it comes from a good place, but you can have the best of intentions and still, cause harm. And I guess that's kind of the truth of anybody who goes into parenting, however that looks, because the joke is always, our kids are going to end up in therapy for the ways we damage them. But, specifically with international adoption, you have these sometimes white suburbia families, or even maybe white families that are expats overseas. They might adopt from a place like Ethiopia, which seems to be really common. And I know that, some people have been given the advice, like, don't just adopt one if you're a white family, because then that one kid feels really othered. Make sure you adopt two, but then there's two. And so I would love your thoughts around some of those narratives that really got very much literally whitewashed to make it look this cute Christmas picture. And then these families, if they hadn't dealt with their racism, could say, well, I'm not racist. I adopted a black kid from Ethiopia. Look how good I am. So how have you seen those dynamics take place?
Oh gosh, that is a really big question. And I think that this is why adoption is subject to so much bipartisan acclaim, right? This is why even in our super divided country, the Congressional Adoption Caucus in Washington remains our largest bipartisan bicameral caucus in the federal government, right? You have plenty of Republicans and plenty of Democrats that are signing on to the idea that adoption is a social good. And I think that what you're talking about, the idea of transracial adoption, kind of this post-racial bona fide, I think is very real. And it appeals to these progressive ideas that we can choose our family, that love makes a family, that you don't need to look like people to have them be part of your family. All of these ideas that resonate with people on the political left are at the heart of adoption, and particularly transracial adoption. And you also have, as you mentioned, and I think it's true, people with good intentions wanting to help care for a child, and that's why they are pursuing adoption. And so what do you do with these good intentions? What does that mean? What does that actually look like? What I always tell people, and this is a little bit tangential to your question, but I promise I'll circle back around. In the United States, when it comes to our domestic adoption policy, we have far, far more people who want to adopt than we have babies available for adoption. So, and again, the private system is almost entirely about babies and infants. You have up to 45 waiting families for every baby that's available. So this is a supply and demand system. This is a marketplace. When you have very, very high demand and very, very low supply, you incentivize the market to generate more supply. And again, I always say I'm using these market terms. It's uncomfortable because we're talking about human beings. We're talking about children as the commodity. But this is how the private adoption system works. And once you have incentivized these intermediaries to generate more supply, then you have agencies, most of which are nonprofit, but will often work with attorneys that are obviously not doing this work pro bono. There's a profit there. Advertising intermediaries, for-profit brokers that work in this adoption space, and they have a financial incentive to target vulnerable families for adoption, right? Vulnerable pregnant people, and to convince them that adoption is the better choice, because your customer base, your consumer base, it doesn't matter what their intentions are, right? They could be a deeply conservative evangelical family who wants to save and convert as many babies by adopting them. They could be anti-abortion people who believe that by adopting they're averting an abortion. Or it could be a really progressive family that maybe you have two same-sex parents who are turning to this over surrogacy because they can't afford surrogacy. Or maybe you have progressive people who just believe that we need more people to care about children and that this is the way that they want to do that. So you have all of the range of intentions, but the market system is largely indifferent to that, right? Because the demand is there regardless of the intentions that people are bringing to the space. And I think that is really the ways that people with good intentions still end up contributing to the system, is that once you grow the demand, as you continue to grow the demand, you are going to continue to support the predatory practices that are pushing more and more families apart. And I think that's really critical. But to get back to your question about transracial adoption and what it's accomplishing, there are not a lot of Black families that participate in the private adoption system as adopting parents. And so I interviewed a lot of mothers of color or white mothers of biracial children who were thinking to different degrees about what they wanted for their family. They almost always wanted a family of color, particularly the mothers who were women of color. The white mothers of biracial children thought about this less. They thought less about that their child was going to be a person of color in a transracial adoption if they chose a white family. And some mothers did end up choosing a white family that already had a Black child. As you mentioned, like this is something you should consider adopting two children, right? But I think that was always a compromise. If they couldn't find Black adoptive parents, they would choose white family that already had at least one Black adopted child, so that their child wouldn't be the only Black person in their family. I think it's more important that we think deeply about why Black and brown families are being targeted by the private adoption system and the public adoption system as well, right? Why are those families being disproportionately separated for the purposes of adoption? I think that's at the core. And I think the other piece is not just saying, oh, well, if you're a white family, you can raise two Black children, and then they're not the only Black person that they know. But what does your community look like? What does the school look like that those two children are going to be attending? Who are they surrounded by? How are you working to make sure that you're parenting them in a way that fully honors their whole racial and ethnic identity as they grow? That's a very, very tall ask for a lot of prospective adoptive parents who most of the time just want a baby.
So true. Most of the time just want a baby. Yeah. And I would love to hear you sort of unpack, because when we get into this conversation, obviously a lot of it is surrounding reproductive health and adoption. The conversation, there's this Venn diagram between the two, especially here in the United States. And I'd love for you to share a little bit more about your role kind of and the work that you do, and how your research really shows the intersections of the work of adoption and reproductive health and sort of the narratives around that.
Yeah, so part of my research was part of the Turnaway study. And the Turnaway study specifically looks at what happens when people are denied access to the abortions that they want. That project was led by my colleague Diana Green Foster. She has a book called The Turnaway Study, which is brilliant because we really followed these women for 5 years of their lives to understand what it looks like after people are denied the abortions that they want to have, and understanding the full impact that it has on their physical health, their mental and emotional health, their relationships with their older children, their relationships with their child that's born as a result of that pregnancy, what it means for their interpersonal relationships, their economic well-being long-term. So it's a very comprehensive picture of what that looks like. My piece was really looking at how women make decisions about adoption after they're denied access to abortion care. So of the women that we studied who were denied abortions, 91% of them ended up parenting the children to whom they gave birth as a result of that denial. So when you have this conservative idea that there are going to be so many babies available for adoption as a result of abortion bans. Actually, what you're going to see is far, far more women parenting children at a time in their lives that they didn't plan to parent another child, with a partner they didn't want to co-parent with, in circumstances that they did not choose to parent in. You're going to have much more of that than you're going to have adoption relinquishments. That was only about 9%. But at the same time, that 9% is a pretty big increase in the number of adoptions in this country. Only about half of 1% of all births are relinquished. So 9% of births after abortion denial, that's a significant increase, particularly given that the number of people who need and want abortions is so high, and the number of domestic adoptions is already so low that even if you take a really small proportion of that, it's still a significant increase in the number of adoptions. But again, because I get a lot of reporters right after the Dobbs decision who would ask me, well, are adoption agencies going to be able to meet the demand? And I'm like, of course, this is a demand-driven system. When you have 45 times the number of families that you do babies available, a 50% increase in the number of babies available is entirely manageable. And also, that question ignores the extent to which adoption agencies are often directly or by proxy part of the anti-abortion movement. So you have a lot of adoption agencies that are associated with crisis pregnancy centers, with evangelical churches. They believe that this work is about saving babies for them, and they're part of the work to undo reproductive autonomy in this country.
Yeah, no, so interesting, all the dynamics that go into it, both politically and in a capitalistic society, and all the, we don't want to think of it that way, but the reality is your research is showing taking a hard look at the nuance is really important. And, it seems as though, and this is sort of maybe a bit of a tired old debate that hopefully I'm hoping we might be moving beyond in this political season, but it's hard to say. It used to be that for a really long time in the United States, you had two choices. It was this very binary choice, like you're either pro-choice or you're pro-life. And the nuance was not able to be discussed because it was such a heated, hot topic that would cause a lot of anger between friends or at Thanksgiving tables or, whatever. And so, but when you do research like this, the nuance of what it has, the effects that it has on women who are typically mothers making these decisions about abortion, there's this, I guess, a cliche that was kind of thrown around for many years and maybe still is, that it's, the person getting an abortion is some teenage girl either in high school or college that just doesn't use birth control and wants to sleep around with a bunch of men, and then therefore just wants to use, quote unquote, abortion as birth control.
Yeah.
But the statistics don't show that, and the nuance of your research doesn't show that. Were there any particular parts of the research that sort of surprised you as you were following these women for the 5 years after?
Well, there were two. So my book is structured with, chapters of analysis by me, and then I wanted to include the interview data in as pure form as I could share with readers. So they're edited quite a bit for continuity, for cohesiveness. I've taken myself out of them. But I wanted to share the actual full stories of these women in as much detail as I could. There are two stories that are included in my book that are women who were denied access to abortion and then ended up turning to adoption. One of them, they were both younger. They were both 19, 20 years old at the time of the pregnancy, and both found out that they were pregnant quite late. So that was why they weren't able to get an abortion. One of them at first wanted to parent the child, and then her partner kind of pushed her to try to get an abortion, and when she couldn't do that, she ended up turning to adoption. One of them really wanted to have an abortion, went to multiple clinics, kept getting sent from a different clinic. Oh, you're too far along for here, but go here. You're too far along for here, but go here, until finally the last clinic was like, you're going to have this baby. You cannot get an abortion at this point. And she turned to adoption as well because she didn't feel that she could parent. So you have both of these women who wanted something very different for this pregnancy and have ended up turning to adoption because they don't feel like they have any other options left to them at that point. Both of them got pregnant again within the 5 years of the study. And the first woman, Sophia, I call her in the book, Sophia, who had at first wanted to parent and then felt that that was impossible because her partner wasn't supporting, she ends up raising the child born from that second pregnancy. And Emily, who had wanted to have that abortion, went to clinic after clinic, gets an abortion right away as soon as she's pregnant. And I think that that's very telling, right? Neither one of them for a second considered adoption again with that second pregnancy. And I think that's a reflection of the ways that the adoption itself for both of their first pregnancies wasn't actually what they wanted. It was what they were left with when all the other options were sort of whittled away. And I believe it was Sophia who said, after that, I knew adoption was the best and only option I had. But if it's the only option you have, you don't have a choice, right? It's what you're left with. And that was what we saw for the vast majority of mothers, whether or not they considered whether or not they tried to get an abortion, adoption was what they were left with at the end of the day. They didn't have a path that made parenting feel possible, and they either couldn't or didn't want to have an abortion.
Having lived in multiple countries, and a lot of our audience is in that category, and seeing the way family is, the concept of family in every society, as well as the government programs that exist or don't exist to support families. It's no kind of global secret that the United States is not doing well when it comes to maternity leave or paternity leave or, all the government programs that would allow motherhood to be an option that was easier for women to choose when, given this pregnancy that they didn't expect or really don't want. And so as you've looked at sort of a geopolitical situation and your understanding of being an American, how could we explain this in a way that maybe that's a new conversation for some people? How do programs like, corporations having maternity leave or maybe something government mandated, how could that kind of thing, or even paid childcare play into this situation?
I mean, that would be huge, right? Most of the mothers that I interviewed were relinquishing their children because of money or because of something that was a proxy for money, right? Maybe it was housing, but they couldn't afford a different living environment. They couldn't afford a security deposit on a new apartment. And they would frame it in different ways. Like, I didn't feel like my boyfriend, I was in an abusive relationship and I didn't want to bring a baby back to that apartment with that partner and I couldn't afford rent on my own. Right? That they were reliant on an abusive partner and that was why they were relinquishing. But money can solve that. Not for every woman in an abusive relationship, but it can help. It can make it easier to leave and to find a way forward. And I don't want to minimize all the complexity that goes into violent relationships, but money was almost always a factor in some way, if not the sole determining factor. When we look at aggregate data on adoption, most relinquishing mothers have personal income of less than $5,000 a year. This doesn't mean that all of them are living in chronic poverty. Some of them are, for sure. But for a lot of them, maybe they were younger, they were still receiving support from their parents, and their parents weren't going to support them. Maybe they were with a partner that they didn't want to be with longer term. And a lot of them were in these tenuous housing situations. They couldn't afford childcare. They needed food assistance. And all of these pieces that create a credible social safety net would go a long way towards keeping these families together. Many of them had jobs, but they weren't living wage jobs, right? They were hourly jobs that they would not have had. It wasn't even that they needed paid maternity leave. They just needed to know that they were going to have a job to go back to, right? And they couldn't count on that after the baby was born. And so I think you see a lot of the ways that these mothers were just falling through the cracks of the places that we really fail to care for children and families in this country. And I think it's really important to know countries that have the better social safety nets do not have domestic adoption the same way that we do in the United States. When you look at Scandinavian countries, now adoption exists or did until they started banning international adoption, but it was importing of children from other countries into Denmark, for example. Danish women don't really relinquish their children. Danish people adopt from abroad or did adopt from abroad, but but Danish women don't relinquish. Icelandic women don't relinquish. If you look in Iceland, they are talking numbers of adoptions in the single digits each year, as opposed to our 20,000 or so. Now, Iceland's a much smaller country, but even when you control for population size, you're talking about a literal handful of cases that are happening in some of these countries, as opposed to tens of thousands with an industry built on top of that type of family separation. And I think that makes the American domestic adoption system unique among developed countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know that Iceland has, great human rights for women. They're one of the better countries in Scandinavia in general. I mean, we hear about just the maternity care, our health care system leaves a lot to be desired in the United States, where even with maternity care, and we have seen, maternal death and infant mortality rise in the post-Dobbs kind of situation. And so all of these dynamics are things that don't often get talked about when people ask if you're pro-life or pro-choice. Those are not the nuances that people tend to want to hear, because people largely, and some of this is just cultural narratives, right? We do want the image is this white baby with a pink bow in her hair, usually a little girl. This is who you're saving when you're pro-life. This is who, these are the pictures, the poster child, so to speak, of the movement, whereas the reality is much more gritty. You use this phrase, the privilege of American motherhood. Unpack that a little more for us.
Yeah. So that's really about who we believe gets to be a mother and who is worthy of their motherhood. And who we believe it's worth keeping children with. And this is as much a value statement as it is a reality in our country. Because a lot of people will hear the story I just told you, like, oh, these are women living in poverty who are separated from their children because they do not have the capacity to afford another child. My response is, what do we do to support vulnerable families, whether or not adoption is part of the conversation, right? Because you have millions of American families that are living in poverty, that are living with unstable housing, with an insecure food supply. How do we support all of them? That's my response. I think that's your response. Hopefully that's most of your listeners' response. But you also have people who say, well, then they shouldn't be raising children. If they can't afford children, they shouldn't be raising children. And we do not have a shared obligation to care for those children. And that is where it becomes a privilege. And that is where adoption becomes a solution. Because if you have these poor people and you're unwilling to support them and you don't believe that they should be raising those children because they are poor, then you are very comfortable with the idea of transferring those babies to middle-class families who are willing to pay for them and are less likely to avail themselves of a social safety net. Now, those families still need affordable childcare, affordable housing. Like, those are still things that are out of reach for a lot of middle-class families in the United States. But we are very willing to transfer children. And that is what I mean when I talk about the privilege of motherhood, is who do we decide to support in their journey to motherhood and parenting, and who do we say is unworthy of that? You see this play out in our policy in a number of different ways, separate from adoption. So you have more and more private insurance companies that will pay for infertility treatments, not robustly, not comprehensively, but to some extent. In several states, you now have insurance companies that are required to cover infertility treatments. But they always exempt their state-based Medicaid programs from doing that. So here in California, your private insurance might be required to cover infertility treatments, but our public Medi-Cal program isn't. So you have this tiered caste-based system where if you can afford private insurance, your infertility treatment will be covered. But if you can't afford private insurance, the state does not consider that your right to access that treatment, to think about how you're going to be building your family. And so that's another way of privileging who gets access to parenting at all, let alone who gets supported after the fact.
Yeah, I didn't know that. That's very interesting. And, there does seem to be this big, like you said, push for adoption in certain circles as a response to the pro-life movement. And then at the same time, it is so interesting how a narrative didn't get pushed or even largely talked about, where families who saw a woman struggling and needing to give up a child would just support her, offer to babysit, maybe offer to pay her rent, bring her groceries, and take that route. What do you think are some of the additional reasons we have not chosen that as a larger narrative in our culture?
So we don't value the work of caring for children outside of the context of parenting in this country. And I think that that's really important. We always need more people to care for children in our country. We don't necessarily need more people who want to adopt babies or older children. A lot of people now engage with the foster care system as a less expensive way of adopting, rather than as a way of supporting a family in crisis and helping work towards reunification and the return of those children to their family. We don't have a concept for supporting a family or supporting children outside of the legally established relationship of parent and child. And I think that that is really important. You'll see adoptive families raising money on GoFundMe or, somewhere to cover adoption expenses. But if you see a mother who is struggling, she's not setting up a GoFundMe for groceries, right? Like that we don't recognize like this family needs support here and we're going to help them have what they need to be safe and healthy and together. But we are going to help support this family with their expenses to adopt someone else's child. And I think that that's really interesting, what we choose to value, both in the work that we do to care for children and the way we direct our resources to care for families.
Yeah, I guess that's where you kind of see the intersection of class and race and gender and all the narratives we have coming together in that whole scenario. We do, and this is not just a U.S. problem, but this is something, globally we see. Other countries do it way better than ours does here in the United States. But just the unpaid labor of home is sort of an expected thing with women. We also expect women to volunteer at the PTA for free at their church or, whatever faith community. We see a lot of women doing unpaid labor that's very, very expected, which, for a single mom in particular, if she was going to choose to, allow a fetus to grow into a baby and raise that baby, would be a significant ask. But it is so much a part of the narrative, it seems like, where we would rather, fund the GoFundMe t-shirts to adopt someone's baby, as opposed to really helping with programs or with our own financial contributions. So how do you see the unpaid labor of home narrative and expecting moms to do all the things playing into this?
Well, I mean, most of the mothers I interviewed, like they couldn't even get that far, right? They couldn't even think that far ahead as far as what that would be like. But I do think it's real because you have these institutions that are really contingent on the unpaid labor of women and mothers in order to function, which just goes again back to why we choose to make motherhood a privilege rather than something that's more accessible to other families. That we want to believe that you have to have this sort of middle class stability in order to be a good parent, because being a good parent doesn't just mean loving and caring for your children and helping them grow and thrive. It also means you need to show up at the PTA and the church function and the Girl Scout troop meeting, and that you need to be able to chauffeur them around town for 15 different after school activities. But this is also part of the persuasiveness of adoption. So with one of my colleagues, Jessica Harrison, we did an analysis of the quote, Dear Birth Mother letters that prospective adoptive parents write on adoption websites. So these are profiles that they put together, people who are hoping to adopt, that are then shared with pregnant women who are considering adoption or who are in contact with adoption agencies. And these letters, these profiles, lean into these these normative ideas of what middle class families should be. So here is our gorgeous suburban home. It's in a nice neighborhood. We have these excellent public schools. We walk to the farmers market, every weekend. Here are our parents who can't wait to be grandparents, our siblings who can't wait to be aunts and uncles. Here's all of us on a family vacation. And usually there's an expression that the prospective adoptive mother intends to be a stay-at-home mother, or talk about her job and how flexible it is, how it will allow her to make room in her life for this child going forward. And when you're a pregnant person who is talking with an adoption agency because you're in a vulnerable place, they're probably doing it because they don't have the financial resources. They don't have the support from their own parents or their own family to raise this child. They don't feel like they have safe and secure housing. And so the profiles speak directly to that, right? Like, I'm thinking about relinquishing this child because my own parents have said they're not gonna support me if I bring this baby home. In this letter, this couple is talking about how their parents can't wait to be grandparents, how excited they're going to be, right? Here's our pictures of Sunday dinner all together. And so that is not just about what we value as a culture. It's also a way of convincing vulnerable pregnant people that adoption is what their child needs, right? Who else? How can you even compare? And some of the mothers I interviewed talked about going to the agencies. And this is something that adoption agencies and maternity homes did before Roe v. Wade and sort of these really coercive, extractive adoptions, but they're still doing it today. Well, they'll give mothers a piece of paper and they'll say, make a list of all the things an adoptive family could give your child. Make a list of all the things you can give your child, and you have the home and the siblings and the cousins and the supportive grandparents, the farmer's market and the pool in the backyard and the family vacations on one side. And they're like, all you can give your baby is love, right? And that's not enough. That's not enough. Anybody can love your child. And it's this diminishment of what mothers can give their child even in more dire circumstances. There's no value placed on the creativity or the scrappiness that comes from having to make it work, having to pull it together. There's no value placed on that biological connection and that familial bond and the connection to their broader family of origin that they can give them. And I'm not trying to romanticize what it means to parent in poverty in the United States. That's definitely not what I'm doing. But we don't value any of those things that families in poverty, that parents living in poverty can give their children, because we believe this middle class ideal is so, undeniably desirable. And part of that is because our social systems rely on the work that those mothers are able to do beyond caring for their children.
Yeah. My last question for you here, just to speak to those who have adopted, whether domestically in the U.S. or internationally, and maybe more than one. Maybe they were those that were trying to do it right and adopted more than one cute little adorable black baby from Ethiopia or wherever. And now they're starting to realize maybe this wasn't the best way. And they're sort of, maybe guilt-ridden. Maybe there's a lot of shame. There could be a lot of feelings around that. Like, what would you say as a call to action for people in that situation and how to move forward?
I think that the best thing that adoptive parents can do at any point in adoption is to truly make space and listen to their child and make it about what that child needs. And I'm using the word child as in parent-child, but recognizing that adoptees grow up, right? You're not necessarily just talking about a baby or a young person, right? That you might be talking about a teenager or obviously an adult. And what people are going to need from their relationships with their adoptive parents are going to change a lot as they grow. What they're going to need for their understanding of themselves is going to change a lot as they grow. And I think the best thing adoptive parents can do is make space for the full range of what their child needs, which might be a connection to their biological family, might be help negotiating a relationship with their biological family where they want to have a relationship with their mother or their biological siblings. But that can be hard, right? Because they're probably trying to form these relationships across class lines after the adoption, with geographic distance, across international borders for international adoptees, some with language barriers, right? That requires a lot of support. And a lot of adoptees are let down by reunions because everybody's bringing a lot of trauma to those relationships as well. And I think making space for the relationships that they want, doing your best to make those relationships possible, giving them space to grieve if they are not possible. I think that those are going to require a lot of work to help and And a lot of adoptive parents get really defensive, possessive of their child, and recognizing the need to put that all aside and knowing that what is best for your child should always be at the core of an adoption.
Well said. Yeah. There's a lot to unpack in families that are facing this with the best of intentions that may be, willing to face the hard conversations. And that's very brave and it's very courageous. And so I really hope that as people listen to this, that we can, feel those feelings and walk through the shame together. And that, there's no perfect situation. I know women in particular face a lot of, narratives that they need to be perfect, especially when it comes to mothers. But this is a way people can make a difference for their child and for the society at large. I'm going to have you on our Patreon to ask you a question there in just a bit. But as we close out here, I'd love for you to tell people how they can find you and more of your work as you go forward.
So I'm on Instagram at Gretchen.Sisson. I am still on Twitter, but probably won't be for very long in this new day and age. But Instagram is it. I'm not going anywhere there. So that's probably the best way to connect. And then the book is Relinquished, The Politics of Adoption and the Privilege of American Motherhood. And I hope to continue the conversation with folks who are interested.
Thanks, Gretchen. It's been great to have you on.
Thanks, Lori.
This conversation really helped me understand so many things that I didn't really understand before, both in the aspects where Gretchen talked about the bipartisan nature of what's going on, both Democrats and Republicans in the United States government really coming together and partnering in a way that may or may not be super helpful to adoptees and to mothers who are being asked to carry a pregnancy from the early stages of just finding out someone is pregnant, from a fetus growing into a baby, and then onward into all of the ramifications of a decision like that, financially, mental health wise, physically, the future of her own career, ability to pay bills, whether she needs to stay in a relationship where she is experiencing intimate partner violence, or so many other nuanced parts of the conversation. And so for those of us who are making decisions about how we vote, making decisions about how we speak to our own representatives in the United States, whether we should give a call to somebody that is our senator or our representative in the House of Representatives, or when it comes to state decisions after in the post-Dobbs world in the United States, whether we should be reaching out to those in our state government that are voting on laws about reproductive care, and also when it comes to adoption, the amount of, tax credit given, like Gretchen mentioned, those were parts of the conversation that really were light bulbs for me. And so, especially after our conversation we had here on the podcast with Cameron Lee Small, and knowing many people who, like she said, have grown up after 2004 when adoption started to go down. And, over time, we started to see countries close their borders to international adoption in various ways. What China has walked through, what we're seeing happen in Scandinavia, and places closing their doors to international adoption arriving in their country. And then also places like China, closing to sending their babies abroad to be relinquished. And then issues going on with, trafficking and all of that in the midst of it, as well as, situations in South Korea and Guatemala, like she mentioned. This is a global conversation and not an easy one. It's very fraught with both shame and guilt and complicity and collusion, even when that was not necessarily known at the time, and when understanding what you were doing felt more like helping. But for those of us who have worked in international relief and development, we often know that helping can hurt sometimes, and that isn't a good thing. I don't mean that in a way where I condone it, where somebody says, well, sometimes helping just hurts, and that sort of is a blanket statement to say you should just be happy with the help that I give. That's not what I mean at all. I mean, if helping does hurt, then we need to relook at it, and we need to center the people that are being helped. We need to gather those together and say, tell me about your experience, and we really listen deeply for those facts and feelings and values, even if it means we don't get to help in the way that we wanted to. And there's no shortage of things that have been written about white saviors. Those of us who have been working in international relief and development have had to, deal with the the nuance of what that looks like and ask ourselves some really hard questions. And so I realize this conversation may be really difficult to digest, and it wouldn't necessarily be something you'd want to do in one sitting, but getting a lot of more perspectives around your own personal table that you invite people into, and creating your own table where you build a village of support around you of people who can speak into your situation to help you understand this better and more deeply with a truly open mind, with curiosity, with taking some risk of vulnerability, and realizing we may not have known everything we thought we knew. And that really is the point of our podcast here, is that we don't all have all the information in our own particular brains. We have these filters, and these filters are created by our own personalities, the cultures we grew up in, the languages that we speak, or the mother tongue that we learned as babies, and all of our experiences of growing up in our little corners of the world with the bodies that we are in. And that means whatever gender we are, and what our race is, and our socioeconomic status, and how that was perceived in each different culture that we lived in. All of that creates a unique filter that is as unique as our fingerprint. And because it's that unique, we really need to check our assumptions, because sometimes we could be wrong. We could see the thing we're looking straight at in a very different way from most people around us. And groupthink can be a really hard thing to overcome. So if you have people around you who tend to always just agree with everything you say, and it's a very sort of homogenous kind of situation, I would encourage you to think about inviting people to speak into this particular situation with you around international adoption, domestic adoption, reproductive care, and all the Venn diagram of what that looks like for babies who get relinquished, and for mothers who relinquish their babies, and to really think deeply by listening to understand, to find out what you haven't known. We don't know what we don't know. And when it comes to speak to us this new information, sometimes that can cause a lot of feelings. And so once again, I always recommend to have a therapist to process these things with, and also to just have friends that you talk it through with. Once again, if you haven't listened to Cameron Lee Small's episode, please go check that out. And I also ask Gretchen to stay around for a Patreon conversation where we go a little bit deeper into a couple of questions. And so that's going to be out in Patreon. If you go to www.patreon.com/aworldofdifference, you'll be able to find that mini-sode there where I ask her some more information. And she really is such a wealth of information. I was so glad that she came on the show to share her very valuable subject matter expertise around this topic. And I think we're going to continue to learn more and more as a culture and society, wherever you are in the world, about this issue. And if you have any questions or concerns, and this has brought anything up for you, feel free to reach out on any of our social media. You can find me no longer on Twitter, because I am at least checking that list, check that off my list of complicity at this point. So I'm off of Twitter, but I've joined Blue Sky recently. So if you want to find me there, you can find me on Blue Sky. And also I'm on Threads, which is the same account as Instagram. So it's at Lori Adams Brown. So either on Threads or Instagram, I'm there. And then on the podcast, it's aworldof.difference for both Instagram and Threads. Would love to have you reach out and express, what this conversation meant to you. Maybe if you shared the episode with somebody else and had a conversation with them, and what that, was like for you. Mostly, I want this whole podcast to be a springboard for you to have deeper conversations with those around you, so that we can make the world a better place in our little corners of the world, one conversation at a time. And that means we don't always see the world the same, but when we listen to each other and truly understand, we come out with both deeper relationships with those around us, and more informed decisions that we can make, where we can reject groupthink and embrace the differences, where we can show that we see the world in a different way. And that's a good thing. We need each other to make the best decisions possible for ourselves, for our families, for our workplaces, for our faith spaces, for our governments, and our societies around the world as a whole. So thank you for joining in today. As always, I know that it's been a difficult season for many of you wherever you are. And I just always encourage you to both take a deep breath, and maybe do that a few more times, and just know that you matter, your voice matters, and you deserve to heal if you've gone through any sort of trauma, and you deserve to have good relationships in your life. And that really starts with you taking care of yourself. And I hope that you find ways to do that in the next few days. And that as you do that, that well of just joy and vibrancy inside you will spill out to those around you, and that you will be able to make a difference in that way, because you matter and all those around you matter too. So keep making a difference wherever you are.